welcome back everybody. Today we're going to start a very exciting chapter. This is chapter 18, which will continue to explore the cardiovascular system, but now we're going to go ahead and switch from the blood over to the heart. The chapter has been divided into 4 parts, and along the way we'll take a look at things like what's the anatomy of the heart, meaning what are the chambers, the valves, some of the internal as well as external features that you come across. How exactly does blood enter and exit the heart? We also have to talk about the electrical currents that run through the myocytes, which are your individual heart cells, and the fact that they're able to electrically excite themselves intrinsically, and that's what then allows for the heart to have a continuous beat every 0.75 seconds. So we have a lot of things to discuss. It's going to be very exciting. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so when you think about the heart, I think many of you will agree with me to say that it's kind of like a pumping mechanism, right? We can take our hand and we can place it in the middle of our chest and we'll hear the heart dum, dum, dum. We'll hear it moving, we'll hear it pumping. And as it's doing that, what it's doing, it's generating enough pressure so that we can utilize it to get blood to flow through our system. When we further zoom into the heart, what we see is that yes, it does work as a pump, but it turns out that it's actually 2 pumps that are working side by side. And what I mean with that is that when we look at the anatomy of the heart, we see that there is a distinctive right side and there is a left side. The right side of the heart is going to be concerned with pulmonary circulation, meaning that it's all about bringing blood over to the lungs. And the way it's going to work is that the right side is going to collect oxygen-poor blood that has traveled throughout the rest of the body through our tissues. It will collect all this oxygen-poor blood, so meaning that blood that is low on O2 oxygen and very high on carbon dioxide, which our body considers a waste product. It will take this oxygen-poor, carbon dioxide-rich blood, and it will go ahead and bring it over to the lungs. And the reason it's going over to the lungs is because every time we exhale, we're able to get rid of that carbon dioxide, and every time we inhale, we pick up additional oxygen molecules, which we can then flow through our bloodstream. From the circulatory system of the lungs, we're going to see that the blood will be able to pick up oxygen and it will go over to the left side of the heart. The left side of the heart is going to take this oxygen-rich blood and it's basically going to be in charge of what we call systemic circulation. Systemic circulation means it's going to allow the blood to travel throughout the rest of the body into all our different tissues, and as it's pumping the blood coming from the left side, this blood is carrying the oxygen and distributing it over to our individual cells. Once the oxygen has been dropped off and the carbon dioxide has been picked up, we see that we switch back over to the functions of the right side, which is that the blood has to start accumulating onto the right side, make its way over to the lungs so it can do the gas exchange, and from the lungs it will return over to the left side, where once again we see that it will go ahead and take that blood that's now once again full of O2 and spread it across the rest of our body. Now, don't worry, we are going to walk through this step by step, and I'll show you lots of illustrations for those of us who are more visually inclined. But our goal, or at least I should say my goal, is at the end of this chapter you feel comfortable with not only what does the heart do as a function, but exactly how does a red blood cell travel from the right side to the lungs, from the lungs to the left side to the rest of the body. So we'll definitely take a look at blood flow. But before we get there, let's go ahead and take a look at some illustrations. All right, so here's a nice drawing of the circuits, meaning the pulmonary and the systemic circulation of blood. And one thing I want to point out is the color code. Now go ahead and take a look right here at the legend at the bottom, and you're going to notice that they're going to use red and blue. Red is going to be the color of blood when it's high on oxygen, meaning it's oxygen rich, so it's carrying lots of O2 molecules. And at the same time, it's going to be carbon dioxide poor. If it's blue, that's going to indicate for us that it's oxygen poor and it's carbon dioxide rich. Now, as many of you know, our body requires oxygen for cellular respiration, meaning the process to generate ATP, chemical energy molecules, correct? So as your body uses oxygen for that, it will generate carbon dioxide as a waste product. So in our previous chapter, we talked about the fact that blood will attach itself to the heme and hemoglobin, and when it does that, it gives that beautiful red color that we're so used to. So if we deplete the oxygen out of our blood supply because we're dropping it out of the blood and putting it into the tissue, what we see happening is as oxygen gets removed, carbon dioxide gets a chance to be picked up, and when carbon dioxide interacts with the red blood cells, usually we see that it has more of a bluish hue. In fact, some of us can go ahead and take a look at our skin tones, especially towards the bottom, the inside by our pulse, and we might be able to see some of our veins. Those are the little blue lines that are running through our bodies. And the reason that's important to point out, and you'll learn more about this in our next chapter, is that the arteries tend to carry blood away from the heart, and they tend to carry oxygen-rich blood, meaning that they tend to have red blood inside of them, whereas the veins tend to return blood to the heart, and they will carry oxygen-poor blood, meaning that it will be blue. Now, when we go to donate blood, how come we never see blue blood? Well, that's an interesting question. It turns out that the minute you make a small little opening through your skin, whether it's the smallest epidural needle that you can find, that little opening allows air to go into the veins as well as the arteries. So that means that the blood is no longer blue. It will then instantaneously turn red because of the O2 molecules that are in the environment. But either way, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself by talking about arteries and veins. Let's go back to the flow of the heart. So on my illustration, I can see right here that they went ahead and they divided my heart onto the left side. And then here is going to be the right side of the heart. Now, the right side of the heart, if you're following the flow, notice how it's mostly colored with blue, and that's because the main purpose of the right side is to contribute to what we call pulmonary circulation. So its job is to carry the oxygen-poor blood that's rich in carbon dioxide, aka blue, go ahead and collect it from the rest of the body, bring it over to the right side of the heart, and once it's in the right side of the heart, what the heart's going to do is it's going to go ahead and pump it over to the lungs. And because it's pumping it over to the lungs, that's then why we call it a pulmonary circulation or a pulmonary circuit. When it gets to the lungs, we're going to inhale and exhale. And as we're doing that, we're allowing the carbon dioxide to be released, and we're inhaling additional oxygen so that once again we can go ahead and change our color from blue over to red to indicate oxygen-rich blood. Now, this oxygen-rich blood that's coming or originating from the lungs is going to circulate itself back over to the heart. But notice how when it returns to the heart, it's going to go over to the left side. So the left side is going to take this oxygen-rich blood and it's going to go ahead, receive it on the left, and then pump it back out to the rest of the body so that we can supply the rest of our organs, our tissues, and our cells. And because we're going to the rest of the body, we are going to call that a systemic circulation. Okay? So right goes to the lungs and left goes to the rest of the body, or systemic. And like I said, we're going to walk through this step by step, and hopefully along the way, the big picture will become clearer and clearer and clearer. But as always, if you have questions, comments, or concerns, definitely go ahead and feel free to email me, and I'll be more than happy to give you some other explanation or some other examples. Now here's a look at the location of the heart within the body itself. So as you can see, it sits right behind your sternum, which is your little breastplate. And what you can do is you can take your fingers and go ahead and right below your little clavicle, your little collarbone, you're going to feel right towards the middle of the chest, you're going to feel a little hardening. That's the sternum bone that you're kind of palpating. And as you can see from our drawing, radiating from the sternum bone are going to be our ribs. The ribs are going to be surrounding the lungs. They have not been drawn in this picture, but the lungs basically sit on either side of the heart. And you can see that the heart is pointing majorly to the left-hand side. And usually what we do from an anatomy standpoint is that the little tip of the heart that's pointing towards the left, we call that the apex of the heart. And I'll show you this on a picture as well. I'm trying to spell this out, and my spelling is just atrocious with this little mouse. But that's called the apex, or the tip of the heart. And the top part of the heart, notice how there's lots of blood vessels. We see the blue and the red. Now, this is actually called the base. I know that's a little weird, right? Normally, you would assume that the base is the bottom. But when it comes to the heart, the base is actually the top part where all the different blood vessels are going to be located. Notice how they even use the color code on the blood vessels. So red is going to indicate blood vessels that have oxygen-rich blood. Blue is going to indicate blood vessels that have oxygen-poor blood. Here's another look. This is what we like to call a mediasternum view, meaning that they've basically cut through, they've done a little cross-section through the sternum, and then what you can see now is you can see your little sternum blade right over here. There's your little bone. Here are the lungs, and then in the back, because this is the posterior view, you see a little vertebra, and then over here you can see the heart now. Now, if we take a cut of the heart this way, we also start to see that there's lots of little openings inside the heart. So part of what we're going to have to talk about is what exactly do you call these openings? And I should really say, what exactly do we call these chambers? They are going to allow us to control blood as it enters into the heart and navigates back out, either if it's on the right side, back to the lungs, or if it's on the left side, navigate the blood throughout our systemic circulation, which is obviously the rest of the body. Now, before we look on the inside and we talk a little bit more about the different chambers and also the valves, let's talk about what's happening for its external covering. As we do more and more organs in 2086, you're going to notice that many of them have a connective tissue layer that kind of protects and wraps around the organ as a whole. Think of it as kind of like taking a Ziploc bag and surrounding the organ and putting it inside of it as a protective mechanism. So the heart is one of those organs that has this little Ziploc bag, this little covering. We call it a pericardium. The pericardium is going to have a double wall sac, a little container. It will surround the heart, and what we see happening is, since it says that it's double walled, that means that it's going to have two layers. The layer that sits directly on top, the superficial layer, is called the fibrous pericardium. And the fibrous pericardium is protecting the heart because it's obviously covering it, but it will also have an anchoring ability because it will allow it to kind of interact with the surrounding structures like the lungs, the sternum, and the ribs, so that the heart can kind of lie in place in its current location. The deeper layer is going to be called the serous pericardium, and the serous pericardium is going to be broken down into two separate areas. You're going to have the parietal layer and you're going to have the visceral layer. The parietal layer will directly communicate with the fibrous pericardium, and then the visceral layer will directly communicate, or I should say come in touch, with the external surface of the actual heart. And I'll show you what I mean with this in just 1 second. Obviously, from an illustrative aspect, it'll make a little bit more sense. But we also see that the interaction between the parietal layer and the visceral layer creates this little cavity. This cavity is called the pericardial cavity, and usually there's about 30 ml of fluid that sits in it, and it acts as a lubricant. So it decreases the friction as the heart beats. Now, in case you're wondering, what exactly is the purpose of this pericardium, this protective layer around the heart? Well, there are many different functions for them. One is the fact that it gives a protective ability to the heart because it's almost like it's saran wrapped, placed in a little Ziploc bag. So if, for instance, the body has a bacterial or a viral invasion, it makes it harder for the pathogen to kind of hop from one organ to the next because they're saran wrapped. They have these sacs that protect them. The other thing that the pericardium will do, and this is what's mentioned towards the bottom of the PowerPoint, is because it has that pericardial cavity with the fluid, it's going to reduce the friction as the heart is beating, especially since it's in such close contact with the lungs within the sternum cavity. So here's a look at our pericardium. So as you can see right here, they've drawn the heart for you, and then notice how they're going to zoom into this little box right over here so we can get another view of it. And what you're seeing is that you have your superficial layer, which is going to be your fibrous pericardium. So that's the layer that's interacting with the other organs, and it's allowing the heart to kind of anchor in place. And then directly below the fibrous pericardium, notice that you're going to have the serous pericardium, first starting off with the parietal layer. So you can see right here, the parietal layer comes in direct contact with the fibrous pericardium. Now notice how the parietal layer, when it gets close to the pulmonary trunk or the base of this blood vessel right here, it's going to fold over and it's going to start interacting directly with the heart. This pinkish tissue is meant to represent myocardium, which basically means it's your cardiac muscle. So it's the actual composition of the heart. So this is my actual heart that the layer is coming into contact with. This layer is what we're going to be calling our visceral layer. So as you can see, visceral means it comes directly in contact with the organ itself. And as it folds over, we can see that we have the cavity that forms right over here. I'm going to use blue to indicate for you your pericardial cavity. And that is then where we're going to have the fluid that's going to reduce the friction as the heart is beating. Now, for those of us looking at our illustration very carefully, you're going to notice that when it came to the visceral layer, they also called it the epicardium, right? They wrote epicardium, and in parentheses, they wrote down the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. Now, it turns out that the reason we can call it both names, either epicardium or visceral layer, is because that location can be used to describe two things. If we call it the visceral layer, then we're talking about the protective layer of the pericardium that surrounds the heart, okay? And the visceral layer is the layer that makes direct contact with the heart muscle. Because it makes direct contact with the heart muscle, it also becomes a layer of the heart. And it turns out that when we talk about the layers of the heart, we cannot refer to them as pericardium. Instead, we're going to call it epicardium. And the epicardium will join the myocardium, which will join the endocardium. And you can see them listed right here. Epi, myo, endocardium. And these three cardium layers together will make up the heart wall. So on your illustration, you can see the epicardium, you can see the myocardium, that's the thickest layer, and then you see another thin layer called the endocardium. So please make sure that when you're doing your homework or when you're reading your exam question, make sure that when it comes to giving a name to the top layer of the heart, you go ahead and you look for an answer that's going to indicate cardium. So if I say to you, what is the top layer of the heart called? You're going to tell me, oh, epicardium, because we're looking at the layers. If I say to you, what is the layer of the pericardium, or the protective sac that comes in direct contact with the heart? Well, if I mention the pericardium, if I mention the sac, the protective entity, then you need to find an answer that's going to say to me the visceral layer, okay? So epicardium is when I'm identifying the layers of the heart wall, and visceral layer is when I'm looking at the layers of the pericardium, or the protective sac that surrounds the heart itself. Now, speaking of the layers of the heart, here you can see, as I mentioned to you before in the previous slide, three layers. The visceral layer, meaning the superficial layer, that comes into contact with the actual heart, and the serous pericardium, that one's called the epicardium, so that's your outermost layer. The thickest layer, which actually does all the work, it's called the myocardium. The myocardium is where you're going to have all your cardiac muscle. And something that's really interesting about the cardiac muscle, and you can see it on the illustration, is that they're actually in a crisscross kind of spiral format. So when the heart beats, it's almost like you're taking a towel and you're wringing it out in a spiral format. So the heart quickly goes up and down as it's beating. It doesn't really go side to side. And that all has to do with how the skeletal muscle, my apologies, the cardiac muscle is arranged, allowing for the myocytes to beat in a uniform pattern. The innermost layer of the heart is going to be called the endocardium. And the endocardium is the one that's going to be interacting with the linings of the blood vessels. It's also the one that's going to be lining the heart chambers and the chambers, as well as covering the cardiac skeleton of the valves. The chambers are the open surfaces that I mentioned to you previously. We're going to name them in a little bit. And then the valves are going to be allowing us to control the blood flow of the heart, allowing the blood to seamlessly enter and exit, whether we're looking at the right side or the left side. So let's go ahead and just take a minute and take a look at this illustration again. And I know we've seen it previously, but I just want to note that they went ahead and they labeled the pericardium. So you have your fibrous, which is the outer one. For the covering, it's the one that interacts with all the other organs and it's anchoring the heart. Then you have the inner layer of the pericardium, which will be the parietal layer. That's the one that interacts with the fibrous pericardium. And the parietal layer will then fold over and make way for the visceral layer. The visceral layer is also known as the epicardium because it is the most superficial or the top layer of the heart wall, followed by the middle layer, which is full of cardiac muscle. That is the myocardium. And then the innermost layer, this is the layer that's going to be directly interacting with the chambers as well as the valves, and that's going to be the endocardium. So please pay attention to the bracket of those three cardiums being part of the heart wall. So meaning that's actually what the heart is composed of. The epicardium, the myocardium, and the endocardium. Now, inside the heart itself, it turns out that we have 4 chambers, and it kind of looks like a little square, but not really. But what we see happening is that we always want to keep the right side and the left side separated from each other, okay? And both sides will have 2 chambers, meaning 4 total. They'll have a top chamber, which is called the atrium. So you have one on the right and one on the left. And then the bottom chamber is called the ventricle. And the way it's going to work is that whenever blood enters into the heart, it always starts in the atrium, and then it will flow from the atrium into the ventricle, and then from the ventricle, it will flow back out of the heart. And one thing you want to keep in mind is, remember, we're treating the heart as 2 separate entities, right? So you have the right side for the pulmonary circulation, and you have the left side for the systemic circulation. So if blood enters the right side of the heart, it's going to go from the right atrium to the right ventricle back outside the heart. If blood enters from the left side, it's going to go into the left atrium and then into the left ventricle. We do not mix and match the blood from both sides, meaning that you won't have blood come in from the right atrium to go into the left ventricle or vice versa. We're keeping the right and the left side completely separate from each other. To assist with this, there's going to be some structures that will make it harder for the blood to mix. So for instance, one of those structures is called the interatrial septum. Anytime you guys see the terminology septum, I want you to think of a wall. Okay, it's usually a larger structure that we can use to kind of separate one area from the next. So the interatrial, inter means in between, so it sits in between the atriums. It's going to be the thickening wall that separates the left atrium and the right atrium. We will also find a little marking there that's left over from our fetal circulation. It's called the fossa of Fallus. I'm going to show it to you in the picture coming up. It's basically a closed up foramen, a closed up hole, because remember when we are being carried during pregnancy, The circulation for the heart is slightly different because the baby is not inhaling through its own lungs. Instead, it's extracting the oxygen and releasing its carbon dioxide through the circulation of the mother. There's another huge septum, which is called the interventricular septum. This one is going to lie in between the ventricles. Now, I know many of you are taking the lab, and part of the lab will be to dissect the heart. And one of the things that you can do when you're dissecting the heart is you can look for this interventricular septum, because it's going to be a perfect marking to make it easier for you to identify which side of the heart is the right side and which one is the left side, because they do look slightly different from each other. And I'll show you all this on the illustration, but just wanted to point out that the interatrial septum is going to separate the atriums, and the interventricular septum is going to separate the ventricles. It literally is all in the name. All right, so let's take a look. This is a nice little picture of the heart. So let's start by finding the interventricular septum. So here you see the heart's been opened up, and the first thing you want to notice is this beautiful thick wall right over here. This is called my interventricular septum, and it's going to allow me to separate the right side of the heart from the left side of the heart. The reason you want to know which side is which is because, remember, right is all about pulmonary circulation, left is all about systemic circulation. So if you're looking at an actual heart and you've opened it up, make sure to find that thick wall that runs towards the middle. That's going to be your interventricular septum. And once you find that, then go ahead and take a look at your myocardium layer. And what you're going to notice is, and I'll draw it for you right here in the drawing, go ahead and compare the myocardium layer here versus here. Okay, so you're comparing this side to this side. And hopefully, as you're doing your comparison, you will agree with me that the first side that I pointed out, so this one right here, is smaller compared to the second one that I pointed out. Now, why do we care which side is smaller or larger than the other? Well, we care because it's going to allow us to clearly identify what is the right side of the heart versus what is the left side of the heart. Since the right side of the heart only concerns itself with pulmonary circuit, it doesn't have a long way to travel. It doesn't have to generate a lot of pressure. So we see that the myocardium is relatively normal size. The left side of the heart, on the other hand, has to create so much pressure to allow the blood to flow through the rest of the body that its myocardium works a little bit harder than the right side. And just like when you go to the gym, when you start pumping iron and you work those muscles, we see that the muscles will go ahead and have hypertrophy, meaning that it will start enlarging and it will start becoming bigger. So the left side of the heart, its myocardium, is always going to be thicker than the right side of the heart. Now, I know some of you might be saying, well, why don't I just look at the apex? Why don't I just look at the tip of the heart right over here? And as I mentioned to you previously, the apex points to the left. So I'll just find my apex and I'll see what side it points to, and I'll have no problem identifying the right or the left. Well, okay, that plan really works if you have what we call a fresh heart, but a lot of times, remember, the hearts have been sitting in preservative. They've also been vacuum sealed, so the apex might not necessarily be pointing the same way because the anatomy of the heart has been slightly altered with the different procedures that they've used. What's never going to change, regardless if it's fresh or if it's been sitting in preservative, is the appearance of the interventricular septum. So always find that thick wall that runs in the middle, and once you find your thick wall, compare your myocardium on the right side versus the left side. And the left side will always have the thicker myocardium wall. Once you know what's right and what's left, then everything else becomes a little bit easier, because then you can see that you have your different chambers, your little openings. Notice how you have your atriums on top, and notice how they went ahead and they labeled it for you, the right atrium and the left atrium. And then the larger chambers at the bottom, those are going to be the ventricles. So you have your left ventricle and you have your right ventricle. Here is the fossa ovalis. That was the little closed-up opening, the foramen that we have when we're in fetal stages. Unfortunately, you can't really see the interatrial septum from this view. It is hiding behind the little pulmonary valve, but you can definitely see the interventricular septum that's separating the right and the left ventricles. Another thing that you can do, and you can do this oftentimes before you even cut into the heart, is you can look for some of the surface features that will allow us from an external standpoint to figure out exactly where the atriums and where the ventricles are. So where the top chamber and where the bottom chambers are. In this case, what we're going to do is instead of looking for a septum, which is a wall, we're going to look for a sulcus. A sulcus is a groove, and oftentimes inside of the grooves you'll have different blood vessels that will anchor their way in, and they'll use that to, in essence, just stay localized within the heart or any other organ. Now, when it comes to the heart, we're going to look for the coronary sulcus and the interventricular sulcus. The coronary sulcus also goes by the AV groove, which is called the atrioventricular groove. And as you can see from that name, it means that that sulcus, that groove, will lie between the atrium and the ventricle. So it will allow you to see the border where the bottom and the top chamber meet together. Your interventricular sulcus, as you see in the name, will lie in between the ventricles. You have one towards the front of the heart, the anterior one, and you have one towards the back of the heart, the posterior one. This sulcus will allow you to see where you have the left versus the right ventricle. So here we have another picture of the heart. Notice how this one is going to be for the gross anatomy, meaning nothing has been cut open. And what I want you to do is I want you to go ahead and take a look at the different blood vessels that have been drawn for you, all the beautiful arteries in red and the veins in blue. And what we see happening is that these blood vessels are lying in a sulcus. They're lying in a groove. And you can see they're either running towards the top or they're running down the middle. The ones that run towards the top, those are going to be your coronary sulcus, also known as your atrioventricular groove, because it's going to allow us to see where the atriums are above it and where the ventricle chambers are below it. The one that runs from the top to the bottom of the heart, that's going to be our interventricular sulcus, because it's going to allow us to figure out where the right side, where the right ventricle is, and where the left ventricle is. So these are just markings on the outside that allow us to figure out where the atrium is, where the ventricle is. And like I said, the main ones are going to be the coronary sulcus, also called the AV groove, atrioventricular groove, and your interventricular sulcus, which will allow us to see the right versus the left ventricle. Here is the anterior view, meaning you're looking at the front of the heart. And here is the posterior view. And when we come over to the posterior view, we're going to notice that we also have our posterior interventricular sulcus being marked right over here, once again allowing us to distinguish where the left ventricle is versus the right ventricle. Also, if you look up a little bit higher, notice how the coronary sulcus, your atrioventricular groove, continues to wrap around the top part of the heart in the posterior aspect, so that it continues to allow you to see where the atriums are versus where the ventricles are. Alrighty, so these are just markings on the external surface of the heart to see where the chambers are located. Now, let's talk a little bit about the chambers, and let's talk about exactly what they contribute. So as I mentioned to you before, the top chambers are going to be called the atriums, atria for plural, and what's going to end up happening is that they are going to be known as the receiving chambers. And the receiving chambers get their name because that is where blood is going to enter into the heart. In order to increase the volume that can be received in the atrium, what we see happening is that on the outside of the heart, we're going to have these appendages called auricles. Auricles means ear. They're going to have these like smooth curvations that are at the bottom that makes it easier for you to kind of identify them. I'll show them to you in a second. But the auricles are these appendages or features that are on the outside of the heart, and they're going to allow us to increase the amount of blood or volume that the atrium can receive. Now, there's definitely a difference between the right atrium and the left atrium. So on your notes, you're going to notice that it says the right atrium, remember right is all about pulmonary circulation, the right atrium is going to be receiving deoxygenated blood from the body. So it's receiving the blood mostly from veins. And this blood is going to be low in oxygen and high in carbon dioxide. And as it's entering into the right atrium, we're going to see that it is mostly smooth-walled on the inside, but it does have these little ridges that we like to call pectinate muscle. So anytime you see a mention of pectinate muscle, like if you're in lab and you're doing a dissection, or you're doing maybe a homework assignment where you're identifying features, if you see the mention of pectinate muscle, I want you to automatically think right atrium. Now, where does the right atrium get its blood from, right? It's coming from the body, and it turns out that it has multiple sources that are going to be dumping the blood inside of it. So let's go ahead and click over to the next slide, and let's give a name to some of these blood vessels that are going to be contributing blood to the right atrium. All right, so we're going to have 3 veins. Remember, veins are the ones that return blood to the heart. Arteries go away from the heart. So 3 veins that will bring blood over to the right side. And these are going to be the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. Now, the vena cava is the largest vein that we have in the body. The superior means that it's above the heart, so that means it's collecting deoxygenated blood above the diaphragm. And the inferior vena cava, that means anything below the diaphragm. So from the stomach area, from the legs, it's taking all that deoxygenated blood and it's bringing it up. Now, the inferior and the superior vena cava will merge right before they get into the right atrium. So it's a single opening that will allow the atrium to fill with this deoxygenated blood. In addition to the vena cava, you will also get blood from the coronary sinus. The coronary sinus is actually involved with what we like to call coronary circulation. That means it's interested in blood that's supplied to the heart itself. The heart is an organ, so it also requires a blood supply. So we see that the coronary veins, the veins that are involved with collecting deoxygenated blood from the heart, they will gather and mostly empty out into a coronary sinus, which is towards the end part, the posterior, the back part of the heart. And from the coronary sinus, that blood will be emptied into the right atrium. The left atrium is all about receiving oxygenated blood from the lungs. Because remember, from the right side, you go to the lungs, and then the lungs will allow you to drop off the CO2, pick up the oxygen, and then now the oxygenated blood is returning to the left side of the heart, and it's going to do so in the left atrium. It will be the pulmonary veins that will bring the blood back to the left atrium. So right over here it says you have 4 of them. The pulmonary veins will return blood from the lungs. You can also see the mention of the pectinate muscle, but notice how you won't find it in the left atrium itself, only in its little appendages in the little auricles. All right, so let's look at this from a visual aspect, right? So we talked about the fact that the atriums are the top chamber. So we have our right atrium and we have our left atrium right here. Notice how both of them are towards the top, right? Because it's our top chamber. Now, focusing on the right atrium, go ahead and find the vena cava, because those are going to be two of the three blood vessels that contribute the blood, right? So the vena cava is this huge blue blood vessel. Remember, it's blue because it's carrying the deoxygenated blood from the body and it's returning it to the right side. And you have your inferior vena cava and you have your superior vena cava. The other blood vessel that we mentioned, the coronary, from the coronary sinus, that one is not featured because it's on the back of the heart, so we need another view. But notice how both of the vena cavas will empty in to the right atrium. Okay, and we could see our little pectinate muscle, the little ridges that are being mentioned. And now if I go over to my left atrium, I'm going to see that the blood vessels that supply my left atrium, those are going to be my pulmonary veins. And I have 4 of them. I have 2 on the left, and I have 2 of them on the right. All right, both of them are going to merge together so they can add blood into the left atrium. Now, I want to show you something interesting. So remember how I said to you that veins carry blood towards the heart? And most of the time they're introduced as blue because they're carrying deoxygenated blood. Well, that's very true for the vena cava, as you can see, nice and blue. But look what's happening with the pulmonary veins. What color are they? They're red. How can that be? Well, it turns out that the pulmonary veins are going to be a small exception to the color code. The pulmonary veins are going to be red because they carry oxygenated blood from the lungs back to the heart. And that left side will then be in charge of getting the blood to be distributed throughout the rest of the system. So as you're looking at your illustration, the majority, 99% of veins will be blue, but when it comes to the pulmonary veins, they're going to be red. It's not a mistake. It's due to the fact that they are carrying oxygenated blood from the lungs. But remember, it's a vein because the veins bring blood back to the heart. So they're bringing it from the lungs over to the left side of the heart, emptying it out into the left atrium. Now, what about the bottom ones, the bottom chambers? These are going to be called your ventricles. The ventricles are called discharging chambers because their job is to return the blood back into circulation and get it out of the heart. The ventricles are considerably larger than the atriums. Your right ventricle is more towards the anterior or front part of the heart, where the left ventricle is more towards the back. But keep in mind that both of these are being held separate due to the interventricular septum. From an anatomy standpoint, we do see that there are some ridges here as well. These ridges are called trabecular carneae. So if you see this key term mentioned, then we're talking about an anatomy or a physical description of the grooves that you find within the ventricles. And you will also have papillary muscles. Papillary muscles are going to be extremely important because they're going to allow us to interact with these little cords called cordia tendinei. And they look like little guitar strings. And what we're going to do is probably in our next part of our lecture, we're going to talk about the fact that the heart uses valves to control blood as it flows from the atrium into the ventricle. And one of the ways that we are going to be able to open and close these valves is by manipulating the cordia tendinei and allowing them to interact with the papillary muscle that we find embedded within the walls of the ventricle. The ventricle, in addition to it being larger, will also be thicker, and part of that is because it will be exposed to a higher level of pressure, allowing the myocardium to thicken because it's working harder. And as I mentioned to you before, the right ventricle, that will all be about pulmonary circulation. So when it's pumping the blood out to the right, out of the right side of the heart, we see that the blood will go into the pulmonary trunk, which will make way to the pulmonary arteries. And remember, arteries carry blood away, so they'll carry the blood away and it will go over to the lungs where it will do its gas exchange. The left ventricle will take the blood and it will pump it out of the heart through the aorta, which is the largest artery we have in the body, and its goal is to allow that blood to circulate throughout the rest of the body, hence we call it systemic circulation. So let's go back to our picture. So now let's find our ventricles. They're going to be our bottom chamber. So you can see right here you have your right ventricle and you have your left ventricle. You can see the interventricular septum, our little wall that's separating them. We have our trabecular carnea. Those are the ridges. Those are the little hallmark anatomy standpoints that you see within your ventricle chambers. And you'll also have the mention of your papillary muscles. See them right over here? So the papillary muscles are going to be the ones that are going to interact with these little white strings right here. And these are our little guitar chords, our little cordia tendineae. Here they are labeled. And what we're going to do is in part 2 of our lecture, we're going to talk about these valves, these little white sheets. And here's another valve that doesn't have cordia tendineae. And we're going to go ahead and give them names and we're going to see what they contribute. But before we do that, I want to make sure that we can find the other blood vessels that were mentioned in our discussion. So on our previous slide, we said that if blood is in the right ventricle, it will get pumped out through the pulmonary trunk, this big blue trunk right here. And from the pulmonary trunk, it will go into the pulmonary artery. Now remember, arteries carry blood away, but remember also that arteries tend to be red. So why is this pulmonary artery blue? Well, because it's carrying away deoxygenated blood. And that's also why the pulmonary vein is red, because it's returning oxygenated blood to the heart. So when it comes to the color code, the pulmonary artery and the pulmonary veins, they're opposites from each other. So please don't be surprised when you're looking at your lab models or when you're doing some homework that when you're labeling your pulmonary artery, look for a blue structure. When you label the pulmonary vein, look for a red structure. And that all has to do with what type of blood they're carrying. Now, back to the left side. If blood is into the left ventricle, then what's going to end up happening is when it's time to discharge, get out of it, it's going to go through this red structure right over here. This is my aorta, which is my largest artery that I have in the body. It's an artery because it carries blood away. And also notice how it's beautifully colored red because it's full of oxygen. And the main purpose of the aorta is to basically take the blood and distribute it through all the other blood vessels that we have so that the rest of our body can have access to oxygen for its tissues and its cells. I'm going to stop part number 1 right over here. Please make sure that at the end of this discussion, you are comfortable with telling me what the right side of the heart does versus the left side. You're comfortable with the pericardium, the protective layer, the layers of the heart wall, and that you also are able to tell me what the difference is between an atrium and the ventricle. All right, having said that, remember you can always feel free to email me any questions. Also use the discussion sections that have been posted for you so that we can have a little bit more interaction with our classmates. And I will hope to chit chat with you soon when we take a look at part 2 of the heart.